Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. I'd like to speak today about the results of the military operations in Ukraine and Russia in 2023, a kind of a sum up of what was going on and who is losing and who is winning. In other words, the question is, what is wrong with the US narrative? When you look at the Western media in the last couple of weeks, what one can hear is a repetition of the old story that Ukraine is winning. The US narrative is actually the Ukrainian narrative. They repeat completely, almost 100%, what the official Ukraine media is saying. And that is that Russia is an aggressor, that every inch of Ukrainian territory will be won back by the advancing Ukrainian troops. The whole unified Western world is behind Ukraine, and they're gonna win over Russia. Russia is losing, Ukraine is winning. The counteroffensive is successful. One village after another is being taken, etc., etc., etc. So what's wrong with this narrative? Everything is wrong with this narrative. This is completely and totally wrong from the very beginning to the end, starting with the point that in fact Ukraine is losing and Russia is winning. And let's go over these facts and then the implications of what is going on. Now, first is, why is Ukraine losing? Ukraine is losing simply if you look at the simple facts. The entire 2023 was the so-called counter-offensive, which pretty much started when the Ukrainian leadership convinced the US to give them, as the commander, the general chief of Ukrainian forces, Zaluzhny, asked them several hundred tanks, several hundred motorized vehicles and weapons of all kinds, and they're going to break through. The plan was, you could see it in my previous videos, to break through to Crimea, to cut it off, the land corridor, to cut it off Russia, and then to bomb and destroy the Crimean bridge, and that way making supply of Crimea impossible, and that way winning the war, assuming that Russians would accept it and say, okay, now you want it, let's just sign peace and that's it. No, none of that of course happened, and the Ukrainian counteroffensive fizzled out sometime in mid-summer, and in the fall it was slowly getting into retreat position, and now the Russians are beginning their offensive. Now, during this so-called counteroffensive, there were hundreds of tanks that the Russians have complete statistics, and I'm not going to bother you with this. Suffice it to say that it's in the hundreds of tanks and hundreds of motorized vehicles and thousands of missiles that were spent on a level that depleted the stocks and supplies of all NATO forces in Europe in providing this kind of military assistance to Ukraine. Ukraine is bankrupt. It needs, and this is official figures, $5 billion to support the civilian operations of the government, and another $5 billion a month to sustain the military operations, which means that even if the US bill passes for 2024, providing them everything they ask, which is $60 billion, this is probably going to last for 3 months and no more than that. And there's a big question if they're going to get that or not. Europeans have no money. Their economies are barely holding out. In fact, the German economy is diminishing. Its industries are collapsing because of the lack of Russian cheap gas. So Ukrainians are also losing because the troop morale is very low. The corruption is pervasive. It now used to cost $3,000 to get a space in the trunk of a car to be smuggled into Poland. Now the figures are $12,000 to be smuggled some way or another to Poland. So there's low morale, there's flight of population, including now men who fear drafting. There are scenes of men being grabbed in the streets and then sent without much training into the battlefield. The the casualties are absolutely catastrophic, but the official Ukrainian data is that just in this so-called counteroffensive, 100,000 Ukrainian men died this past year, 2023. Um, so Ukraine is unfortunately for them is losing. On top of it, there's a widening rift between President Zelensky and the chief of general staff Zaluzhny, who rumor has it wants to run for presidency. Zelensky is scared and wants to bar him from doing that, and they've been recently uncovered that Zaluzhny's phone was bugged, and so on and so forth. So the very idea that Ukraine, armed with NATO, could win over Russia was a big strategic mistake of the United States planning, because they don't know what they got into, and now they're gonna pay the price and the consequences. So let's talk about Russia. Why Russia is winning? It's winning not only because it's 3 times bigger in population than Ukraine, but it's winning for a whole lot of other reasons. Number one, Russian military industry proved to be much more powerful, much more resilient than any experts in the West had ever imagined. Why is that? It is because the Soviet military industry, which was frozen, which didn't function very well, which was, retooled into civilian production in the 90s, was turned back to what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be, and it acted as such. Soviet military industry run by the state. Now, it means that it is pretty much independent of the dollar rate, of the supply chains. Every supply chains were established for decades during the Soviet production. All these factories in Siberia and in the Urals, they just go full steam, and the statistics is that they quadrupled production of tanks and armored personnel carriers, and they're producing now all kinds of other equipment, and the Iranians gave them blueprints for missiles which they adapted, and now they use those. In other words, Russian military production is now 3 times higher than it was 2 years ago. Not only they're not running out of any missiles, they're producing it in such quantities that the entire NATO would have to put a big effort just to keep up with that if they chose to. But they can't, because it's going to take a lot of time to do that, and because they don't have the money or the resources or the support of the public opinion in their countries to do that, because nobody in Germany wants to die or fight so that Ukraine has Crimea. Not even the Poles want to die and fight so that Ukraine has Crimea or the Donbass. In other words, the political situation in the West European countries is such that they're nice to talk about the support of Ukraine. They want to give something that's in their store facilities, but they're not able to provide serious, massive military assistance to Ukraine for it to sustain, which means Ukraine is going to lose. On top of it, Russia has enormous sort of patriotic upsurge, and there are hundreds of thousands of men who volunteered. There's no need for any mobilization, as Shoigu, Minister of Defense, announced many times, because they have about 50,000 volunteering every month. So Russia is winning because they have 700,000 volunteers who joined the forces in the last year, and they don't need any mobilization whatsoever. The latest figures that President Putin announced was that Russian GDP increased 3%. Its unemployment is as low as it had ever been, and the economy, despite all the sanctions imposed by the West, is growing. Whereas in Western Europe, it's actually diminishing. It's by 0.5% in Germany. All of that is basically because the Russian economy is not dependent, as it was in the 1990s, on Western investments and Western supplies of critical materials. They managed to get whatever they need from China or from friendly countries that can buy for them some of the equipment that they still need that they don't produce themselves. Some witnesses say that today you could just get absolutely anything you want in Moscow, just as in the old days of booming Western influence, except that it's a little more expensive. It has to come via Kazakhstan or Georgia or Turkey or Belarus or some other countries that can provide these kinds of shipments. Now, another thing that the 2023 has shown, which is very important for NATO to learn, is that it is impossible to win the ground war against Russia. Impossible. If the Ukrainians couldn't do it and they lost 100,000 men, who would seriously think that the Poles could do it better? Or that the Germans would do it better, or even the Americans would do it better. If you suppose ship American troops there, put 500,000 American men in Ukraine, you think they're going to do better fighting Russian army? I doubt it very much. Yes, they would probably have F-15s and 16s and F-35s, but the Russians have their own Su-35s against those. If the West Europeans join the Polish or German army and start long-range missiles hitting interior of Russia, well, then the Russian missiles would go fly back to Warsaw and Berlin, and their favorite target would be London, that is now providing long-range missiles and targeting Russian fleet in the Black Sea. In other words, the ground operations have not produced what the West and NATO and Austin and Biden and all these people wanted to, which is to humiliate Russia, to create a strategic defeat of Russia. All of that failed. So 2023 showed that the Western strategy of trying to defeat Russia militarily on the battlefield has failed completely. What is going to happen is what I told you many times in the preceding videos, is going to be 2024 Russian victory. The only question is, where will they stop? What they would choose, and that is of course totally unknown. That depends on many factors, the elections in Russia itself, the elections in Ukraine, and also which factors the more moderate or the more extreme will win in Russia itself. What the program minimum, as I had been saying for years, would be to take Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, which is not actually Ukraine, but Novorossiya, which means New Russia, which is the provinces that had been taken over by the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at the time of the Soviet Union, done by Lenin and Stalin. These territories would be Odessa, Kharkov, Kherson, and Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk, or Dnipro, which is pretty much along the southern edge of Ukraine and southern and eastern Ukraine, or Novorossiya, New Russia. Now that's minimum. What may happen too is the advance all the way to Kiev, and that would be also something that used to be part of Malorussia, or small Russia, in the 19th century and early 20th century. And then there's the question of Western Ukraine. I think Putin made it very clear he does not want to have it inside the territory controlled by Russia. So some kind of arrangement, whether it would be a protectorate, whether it would be a satellite, but it was most definitely not be a government that is fulfilling the orders from Washington or NATO. So it'd be some kind of a rump Ukraine that's neutral. We shall see. This is something to watch out in 2024. And this is my roundup of what happened and whether the Western narrative was true. It obviously wasn't. Thank you.